then at the break time, organize the working groups for the final reports. One of the books I recommend to you is this one here, A World of Rivers, where each chapter deals with a different major river system in the world. And what's good about the book is also the methodology, because it deals with the ecology of a river, its geological origin and history, people's relation to the river, the way in which human activity transforms the river, the complexity of the ecological communities. Each of these rivers is quite different. Some are relatively young historically, others are ancient. Some of them have a great diversity of species, like the Amazon does, or the Mississippi. There are others that are relatively poor in species, either because the climate is harsh or because they're relatively young. So it's possible for the working groups to choose one or two rivers as a topic and use that as a jumping off point for dealing with ecological principles. Now, in a course that's so short, where we barely touch on the different topics, there's some discussion of the ecological substance, but also there's what we might call a subtext. That is something which deals with the theoretical framework for understanding ecology in the broader sense of the relationship of our species with the rest of nature. So, for instance, in today's session, when we deal with new and resurgent disease, we're also going to deal with the question of scientific error. Why is it that places like the School of Public Health ignored infectious disease? Why did they believe here 30 years ago that infectious disease had been eliminated? Now, when we deal with the history of science, we deal with theories that were mistaken. And so we have to ask the question, why were they mistaken? The people who promoted mistaken theories were just as smart as we are. And they had evidence, they had argument, yet they got it wrong. So the question is, what is the structure of error? How come they had it wrong? What can we do to rectify error? Then when we deal with the question of the complexity of ecological communities, I would like to deal with the subject of complexity. And how do you study complexity? When we deal with population dynamics, we'll have some mathematical models for the growth of populations. But we'll also deal with the question of how come those models can be misleading. Mathematical models are our own intellectual constructs of the world. In setting up these models, we create objects of interest. Then we see how these objects of interest interact. And then we discover that these can be misleading. So one of the subjects that we look at is, in what ways will models be misleading? The section on anthropological ecology is concerned with the question of historical change, that different human societies related to nature in different ways, but furthermore that they are divided socially into different kinds of societies. Some of them are divided into classes, some are more or less egalitarian. Different kinds of societies also incorporate women in different ways. So running through the course then, there are going to be explicit discussions of ecological substance, but also a subtext which deals with some general, broad theoretical issues. Now, one of the issues which is increasingly important is surprise. How come our species is surprised by various kinds of events? And these can be natural events or social events. But in order to deal with surprise, one thing we can do is ask, how do other species deal with surprise? After all, they've been coping with surprise for 2 billion years. So what kind of general principles can we learn from that? Or today I'm going to deal, to some extent, also with the question of vulnerability. And the general principle of Schmalhausen's law, which states that a system which is at the boundary of its tolerance in extreme or unusual conditions will also be more vulnerable to everything else that happens. So vulnerability is an important ecological principle, and we have to ask, how is vulnerability different for different groups of organisms or for different societies? I'd like to encourage you to interrupt whenever there's a question that you'd like to ask. In the 1970s, the epidemiology department at the School of Public Health decided that infectious diseases had basically been eliminated, and that the important diseases of the future were the chronic diseases, in particular cancer and heart disease. This influenced the decisions that were made about appointments to the faculty. It also led to the abolition of the Department of Microbiology. There's relatively little microbiology going on at the school at the present time. The communities of protozoans and bacteria and fungi that live in water, the way in which different water systems contribute to agricultural production and also to the spread of disease. So the department essentially said that we had licked infectious disease. Now, science has a long history of error. Some of these are given as classic examples. Sometimes we're shown medieval maps of the Atlantic, positions of winds. Sometimes new concepts of our relation with the environment enter in. Some of the things that are new, relatively new, are, for instance, the phenomena associated with El Nino and the cyclical changes in climate, or the long-term changes in climate that have taken place. Because even though we are a relatively young species, we're old enough to have experienced major changes in climate. If you look at the history of the Sahara region, the Sahara wasn't always dry. There are times when the Sahara was wet enough for people to support themselves by fishing. And excavations in the oases of the Sahara turn up fish hooks, bones of fish, remnants of larger populations. So we have the sense then that the way things are is not the way things have always been. And we have to ask the question always, things are the way they are because they got that way. That is, because they have been subject to change. And if they got that way, why did they get that way? How quickly do they change? What are the different ways of life that people constructed in order to be able to deal with changes in climate? The boundary of the Sahara has changed quite a few times. we talk about the Sahel, a semi-arid region that reaches down from the Sahara toward the West African areas. That also is historically new. The southern edge of the Sahara was the end point for major caravan routes. For salt, blocks of salt would be transported in caravans across the Sahara. There was also gold mining in the old kingdom of the Songhai in West Africa. So each region of the world has a history, and that history includes natural conditions and how these natural conditions affected the way people cope. One way in which people cope with changing conditions is to move. And there's a long history of people moving from one place to another. You can detect this sometimes through language. For instance, the dominant language of Northern South America belongs to the Guarani group. But there are places in South America that have communities that speak totally different languages. And we know that among the Northern South American languages you have Quichua, Quechua, Aymara, and other smaller groupings. In China, there are enclaves of languages unrelated to the Han Chinese. And these are the survival of pre-Han populations. So you'll find them scattered about in different places surrounded by other groups. Taiwan was settled by waves of immigrants from the mainland. But in Taiwan at the present time, there are still groups that speak languages unrelated to Han Chinese. These are the native Taiwanese languages. And Taiwan was the jumping off point for settlement of Indonesia, and then from there eastward into Polynesia and westward toward Madagascar. The population of Madagascar, the Malagasy people, apparently settled from Borneo. Linguistically and in terms of artifacts, they can be related to the contemporary population of Borneo, and they also encountered populations migrating from East Africa. So you get languages that are combinations, genetic makeup, which is seen partly in the physical appearance of people, and so on. So the general rule is that people are where they are because they got that way. That nobody's been there forever. The claim that's made by nationalists that our ancestors cultivated the land here for millennia in the same way is almost always a lie. The Spaniards talk about having inhabited Spain way back from pre-Roman time. In fact, they were not Spaniards. They were other groups. They were the ancient Cantabrigians, the ancestors of the Basques, people who spoke very different kinds of languages. Until the Romans came in, you got the introduction of Latin. Then later on, the Goths, who introduced a Germanic type language into Spain. Modern Spanish is about 1,000 years old, and it was derived from some of the populations of northern Spain. You had Aragon, Leon, Galicia, Castile. You begin to see accounts. There was a Count of Castile who later on began talking about himself as a king. The Aragonese tended to orient toward the Mediterranean and relations with Italy, whereas the Castilians oriented toward the plateau of central Spain, sheep herding, and later on reaching out toward the Americas. So it's always important to consider what is the history of a people, where did they come from and how come, what did they do for a living, also what are the changes in their language. Because modern Spanish is often referred to as Castilian, but in fact it includes elements of some of the other populations of Spain. It also includes languages of the Middle East, because in the 7th century there were invasions of Spain from North Africa. And there were two kinds of populations that came from North Africa, the Arabs and the Berbers. The Arabs speak a Semitic language. The Berbers belong to the Hamitic group. So linguistically they're different. They tended to be more located in the desert, engaged in herding. Ideologically, the Berbers tended to be more conservative theologically. And some of the times when the Berbers invaded Spain, it was to correct what they considered to be deviations from true Islam. Yusuf was the commander of the Berber invasion, and he was very oppressive toward the Arabs. Arab culture was far more cosmopolitan. In addition to Arabic itself, there was a mixture of Turkish and Persian, and some of the smaller ancient groups, Aramaic, Hebrew. And each of these groups also had different cultures. For the Arabs, coming as they did from a very dry region of the world, from the Middle East, water occupied a very important role in their thinking. So the oasis, the irrigation system, the irrigation pump, where you have the water wheel, all of these were elements of the North African and Middle Eastern conquest of Spain. There was also invasion coming into Spain from the north, from the pre-French, the Goths. So the Goths were ruling Spain at the time of the Arab-Berber invasion. And in the early period of that invasion, there was a very rich mixture of cultures. Toledo was a center of Arabic and Berber rule, but it was also the site of the Bishop of Spain and of Catholic scholarship. It was the place where Jewish scholars were translating the works of Islamic scholars into Arabic, into Latin, then later on into Spanish. So when people make claims about this being their ancient home, always introduce an element of skepticism. Nationalism arose with the decline of feudalism. Now, in feudal societies, there wasn't any sense of citizenship or of national loyalties. An individual was loyal to an overlord. They would be given a grant of land. In return for that grant of land, they might have to provide troops and a certain amount of produce from the land. So, for instance, El Cid, the great hero of medieval Spain, was given a certain number of villages to rule, engaged in agriculture, engaged in trade, and is referred to as one of the founders of the Spanish nation. The Franks had the Chasson de Roland, which is an account of Charlemagne invading Spain and engaging in battle both with the Arabs and with the Basques. I think mostly with the Basques, even though the stories the stories are full of references to the Arabs, and they'll have stories about how the Arabs came charging in crying Muhammad, and the French, being Catholics, were naming saints. In Spain in particular, among the Spaniards, there was a very strong sense of religious identity. And Spain was unique in that you got orders of monks that were military orders. So the Order of Santiago was a teaching order of monks, but they were also military, and the head of the missionary order of the monks was also the commander of the monkish, the Santiago armies. Later on, northern Spain in Santiago de Compostela became a major shrine for Catholicism. It contained relics there. There's supposed to be a relic of St. James, and St. James was the brother of Jesus. We don't know how the relics got there, but rather early in Spanish history, it became a site of migration, of pilgrimage. Now, getting to this migration site was difficult. So routes appeared crossing the Pyrenees, the routes of the pilgrims, and there would be guest houses, hostels, people coming across the mountains, going to the site of pilgrimage, and then after that either going home or settling in Spain. So early Spain was an extremely heterogeneous group of people coming from other parts of Europe. The word slave comes from the word Slav. And there was an active slave trade in Europe, carrying prisoners into Spain. Some of these converted to Islam and became the rulers of the tiny little kingdoms. Because Spanish or Muslim Spain was originally a caliphate ruled from a center. And the center included centers like Segovia, Toledo, and Granada. But they fell apart. They began to break down, and in later Islamic rule, what you got was the golden necklace, the taifas. These were small kingdoms, sometimes ruled by relatives. And it was this period when they patronized poets and scholars, and were a very active part. They were engaged in military conflict with Catholic Spain, but also with intellectual activities. And they boasted very much of the intellectual produce, the translations, the books, the libraries. And there were pretty good friendly exchanges. Alfonso the Wise, a Catholic king, engaged in having translations made of Arabic works and works from Central Asia. Later on, by 1492, the Catholics began pushing the Muslims out of Spain. These were from the kingdoms of Aragon, Leon, Navarre, and particularly Castile. Castile emerged to be dominant, and so about 1,000 years ago, you begin to get the sense of a Spanish nationalism at the same time that there's French nationalism further north. The English begin to identify themselves, and later on the Scots. Nationalism was the substitute for the feudal loyalties, the oaths of fealty, where somebody would be loyal to a particular overlord rather than to a country. And you get these peculiar situations where the same minor lord would owe loyalty to the King of Spain, but also to the King of France, and to British dukes, And so when there were conflicts among these three, they would have to decide what side they were on and who to send troops to. Nationalism was the attempt to create loyalty in the beginnings of capitalism. You didn't swear loyalty to Filene's basement. The loyalty was to a region. And the regions were first sort of sub-nationalities. You hear them like Burgundy, Bohemia. Later on, you begin to create the legends of nationalism. The Scots were particularly creative in inventing a nationalist history. For instance, the Scottish tartan, the famous plaids that identify the clans of Scotland, were invented by Englishmen of the wool industry, creating the patterns in order to be able to create markets. The Scots also created histories of the different clans. And the encouragement of the Scottish language is partly a question of preserving a kind of nationalist identity. So, now in Germany, you had the German languages, which are different enough from each other to make it hard to understand. A Prussian would have trouble with Bavarian, for instance. Viennese, the Austrian language, would be different from Prussian. Prussian was regarded as a rather harsh language compared to the more gentle languages of the South. And it was not until the time of Bismarck in the late 19th century that you begin to get the unification of Germany. And more or less around the same time, under Garibaldi, the unification of Italy. These included the war against the popes, against the papal states. The popes were secular rulers for the middle part of Italy until the nationalists drove them out and eventually set up an agreement which allowed Vatican City to remain as a little enclave of popish rule. So the nationalisms are a relatively young creation. This is also true in Africa. In Southeast Africa, the Zulu peoples organized to resist the invasions of the Dutch. The Zulus were essentially a language group, different tribes that spoke a similar language, until under the leadership of Chief Shaka, they developed military resistance to the Dutch. And there are some famous battles that the Zulus are proud of. The Zulu dagger and spear are still important symbols in Zulu politics. So the nations began forming under colonialism. The European countries chopped up pieces of Africa, set up systems of rule, and then labeled them. So the countries that we recognize as nations of Africa, like Nigeria, Ghana, Botswana, these are countries that were the result of colonial divisions of Africa. And very often what the colonialists did was find some chief and convert them into kings. So monarchy in Africa is a relatively late creation of colonialism. So all of this is background for talking about the fact that people have a history, that they are the way they are because they got that way. They've not been doing the same thing for millennia, but rather adopted things to do. That they were all inventive. For instance, there was iron smelting in North Central Africa at Meroe way back into late ancient